Chapter 23:41. Then he carried her into the bathroom and pressed her against the mirror while he was behind her. His face was against hers, and he held her chin with one hand, forcing her to look up at the person in the mirror. Their eyes met in the mirror, and his voice was hot and hoarse. "Look at you now. Do you still dare to say that you're disgusting?" Qin Mu closed her eyes and said, "Zhou Chengwang, don't make me hate you. You've hated me for a long time. Otherwise, why wouldn't you have my child? Do you think I'm dirty?" His voice rang in her ears. "Then I'll make you feel disgusted." Qin Mu's voice trembled. "Zhou Chengwang, what do you want to do?" "Make love." He softly spat out the two words, squinting at her in the mirror. At 22 years old, Qin Mu was still young. However, because he had been nourished a lot recently, he had gained a little more charm, which made men fall for him. She opened her eyes and looked at him. She struggled and said, "Zhou Chengwang, you bastard." His voice was hot. "Yes, I'm a bastard." Then he would be a bastard to the end. He didn't let her go until midnight. As soon as he let go, Qin Mu's body slid down, and Zhou Chengwang caught her. Qin Mu angrily reached out and pushed him away, sliding straight down to the ground. Zhou Chengwang reached out to hug her. Qin Mu's voice was soft, but her voice was hoarse. "Get lost." She had never been so rude before, because he had never been so rude. Qin Mu closed her eyes and didn't want to look at him anymore. She leaned against the sink and took a while to prop herself up, but then she slid down again. Zhou Chengwang picked her up forcefully. "What are you trying to do?" After venting, the man was different. He was in a good mood, and he carefully carried her to the edge of the bathtub and filled it with hot water. The steam made the bathroom look hazy. Qin Mu couldn't move after a while, and she lay on the edge of the bathtub, panting. At this moment, she was a mess, and her body was covered in red marks. On the other hand, Zhou Chengwang was perfectly fine. Everything was neat and tidy. What happened just now was very humiliating to her. Zhou Chengwang didn't force her. When the water was half full, he carried her in. Qin Mu didn't struggle because she needed hot water to soak in. She raised her head, and because of the pain and comfort, her small throat moved gently. Zhou Chengwang felt that he had just calmed down, but now he was back to his senses again. He stared at her for a long time, held back, and gently washed her body. Qin Mu resisted, but her resistance was cold. She looked into his eyes and didn't give him any reaction, which made Zhou Chengwang's eyes turn red. When he picked her up, he said in a low voice, "Mu Mu, are you going to use cold force on me?" Qin Mu closed her eyes. "I want to have a good sleep. Don't bother me." She was very tired. The result of provoking him was that all the bones in her body were about to be broken. At this moment, she felt a little regretful. Zhou Chengwang looked at her powerless appearance, and his eyes were full of guilt. He carried her back to the bedroom, turned on the heater, and said in a low voice, "I'll guard you." He laid beside her. Qin Mu opened his eyes and looked at him with a deep gaze. Zhou Chengwang reached out and rubbed her long hair. "Does it hurt?" Chapter 23:42. Then, she raised her hand and gave him a tight slap on his face. Her face was cold and clear. Scram. Zhou Chengwang was also stunned. He hadn't expected her to have the strength to hit someone at this time, but he wasn't angry. Qin Mu lay back down after slapping him. She was so angry that she didn't want to look at him, so she moved her back to him. Zhou Chengwang hugged her waist from behind and said in a low voice, "Are you still angry?" Qin Mu didn't say anything. She just said, "Zhou Chengwang, I'm tired." She wept as she said this. She thought that she didn't care about those women, Lin Shui and Gu Mei, anymore. But now, she was still a little disheartened. The better he was to her, the more she cared about him, and she didn't want to tell him about this. It was too embarrassing, and he was too hateful. Zhou Chengwang was a little angry at first. He lay flat, feeling that it was useless to coax a woman like that. He was thinking too much, thinking that maybe Qin Mu might really like Zhao Yan. After all, Zhao Yan was very similar to Zhou Chengwang in the past, young and beautiful. The more Zhou Chengwang thought about it, the angrier and more worried he became. He brought Qin Mu over. He wanted to interrogate her, but he was stunned when he saw her little face. Qin Mu was crying very hard. Although she didn't make a sound, her little face was full of tears. Zhou Chengwang was stunned for a moment. Then he reached out to wipe the tears from the corners of her eyes. He rubbed them bit by bit, and she immediately started crying again. His heart ached as he rubbed them. "Moo Moo," he said in a low voice. "Moo Moo, don't cry. It's my fault. I shouldn't have done that to you." Tonight, he had done it so badly in the bathroom that he didn't even change his position. After a long time, she would naturally feel pain. Qin Mu's little face was lowered, and she refused to speak. Her delicate body was trembling. The bathrobe slid down, revealing a shocking scar on her shoulder. Zhou Chengwang sighed slightly and kissed her eyelids again and again. "Moo Moo, it's my fault. I apologize, okay?" Qin Mu smoked and ignored him. After a long time, she slowly opened her eyes and looked at him. "You raped me in marriage." Zhou Chengwang sighed. "Yes, I'm a bastard. Don't cry, okay?" But the more he coaxed her, the more she couldn't stop crying. He gently opened the bathrobe and looked at the scars. His heart was filled with guilt. He kissed her bit by bit, kissing the scars and soothing her pain. She kept trembling and resisting his presence. In the end, he took her tenderly, very tenderly, never before. "Baby, don't cry." This was the first time he had coaxed her like this. He kissed her while asking for her tears. He didn't know how to treat her. Qin Mu was still crying hard, but no matter how much she cried, he didn't let her go. He was determined to do it. In the end, she turned her little face to the side and clutched the bedsheets tightly with her slender fingers. Zhou Chengwang kissed her long eyelashes, kissed her rosy lips, and kept calling her baby. Although it was so gentle, it felt unprecedented. "Hold me, Moo Moo," he coaxed her with a hoarse voice. Qin Mu bit her lip and didn't want to be close to him. He simply grabbed her little hand and wrapped it around his neck. Chapter 2343. Qin Mu's tears fell like rain. This bad guy knew that she hated him so much at this time, but he still said these three words. These three words, however, seemed to have injected new life into their exhausted marriage. Qin Mu bit his shoulder, and her fingernails sank deeply into his shoulder and back, leaving a few long bloodstains. Looking at the wound, Qin Mu was stunned. Then, as if she was addicted to scratching, she scratched his body to vent. Zhou Chengwang also let her do it. Not only did it not relieve his anger, but also made him even more excited. He didn't rest for the entire night. He only let her go when the sun rose. When he let her go, Zhou Chengwang felt that Qin Mu was on his last breath. Only then did he feel that he seemed to have gone too far. He whispered in her ear, "Moo Moo, go downstairs and get you something to eat. You can sleep after eating, okay?" Qin Mu lay on the pillow and didn't say anything. Her brown curly hair was spread on the pillow, and the quilt was covered below her shoulders. She looked so beautiful. Zhou Chengwang took a deep breath and admitted to himself that she actually had a lot of capital. There was a reason why those men were around her. He had to convince himself that she was now Zhou Chengwang's wife. He should thank her for being born in the Qin family and having a strong sense of contract. Otherwise, a contract wouldn't be able to bind her. He kissed her back, opened the quilt, got up, put on a pair of trousers and a shirt, and opened the door to go downstairs. Although it was dawn, the servants in the villa had already gotten up. It was probably because of the noise all night that everyone couldn't sleep because they were worried. At this time, seeing Zhou Chengwang coming downstairs, the steward came forward and smiled. "Mr. Zhou, are you up?" But his heart was as clear as a mirror. He had been playing until now and hadn't slept yet. It was really rare that Mr. Zhou had been outside all these years, but his body hadn't been drained. Now he still had so much energy on Mississippi. But to be honest, in the past, when Mr. Zhou had a woman outside, he was also very restrained. How could he not be restrained like now? In the past, he would come back before 12 o'clock. He had never played all night like this before. Zhou Chengwang nodded and looked at the servant. "Is there any porridge that has just been cooked?" The steward immediately said, "It's just been cooked. Just wait for another 5 minutes." Zhou Chengwang personally went to check on her. When she was done, he scooped a medium-sized bowl and placed it on a tray. In the bedroom, it was quiet. Qin Mu was still lying there, as though he was asleep. Zhou Chengguang placed the tray at the head of the bed and called her name in a low voice, Mumu. Qin Mu looked up at him and lay down again. Her voice was a little muffled. Zhou Chengguang, I want to sleep. Don't come. I can't take it anymore. She lay on the ground heavily, looking extremely tired. Then he simply picked her up. Qin Mu was probably in a little pain, so she groaned softly. Zhou Chengguang held her in his arms and kissed the corner of her mouth. Eat something hot before you go to sleep. She closed her eyes, didn't make a sound, and didn't resist. So he held her with one hand and fed her with the other. It was the first time that Zhou Zong had done such a thing. It was the first time that he had served a woman like this, and he felt indescribably satisfied. Feeding her like this and looking at her fragile little face reminded him of the first time they had sex. It was their wedding night. It was her first time, but not his. Chapter 2344. When he married Qin Mu, he was no longer the Zhou Chengguang. He already had a woman outside, Gu Mei and countless Lin Shui. He didn't even remember the names of those women. Their first time, Qin Mu was also in so much pain, but at that time, he didn't show any gentleness at all. Instead, he knew how painful it was for her, so he deliberately tortured her. Zhou Chengguang restrained his expression, dug a small spoonful of it, and brought it to her lips. His voice was incredibly gentle. Mumu, be good. Eat something. He didn't feel disgusted at all. Instead, it was very natural. Qin Mu didn't open her eyes, but she ate it. Zhou Chengguang smiled lightly, and there was indescribable satisfaction in his heart. It seemed that feeding her like this was a very happy thing. At this time, there was no longer the excitement just now. Instead, it was quiet, but this silence was even more beautiful than before. Bah, Zhou Zong was ruthless, but he felt that real happiness was more powerful. He fed her in small mouthfuls, and Qin Mu also ate obediently. In this way, she actually finished a small bowl. Zhou Chengguang put the bowl aside and lay down with her in his arms. Qin Mu was also really tired and in pain. He nestled in his embrace and quickly fell asleep. Looking at her sleeping face, Zhou Chengguang suddenly hugged her closer, pressed his face against hers, and said in a low voice, Mumu, be good. I'll be very good to you. But she slept very soundly in his arms, looking very obedient. Zhou Chengguang smiled bitterly. When she woke up, she probably wouldn't be so obedient. That was the truth. Qin Mu woke up at about 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and Zhou Chengguang also slept with her until the afternoon. During this period, he only took a nap. At other times, he opened his eyes to look at her, for fear that he would miss the time when she woke up. As soon as Qin Mu woke up, he kissed her on the face. You're awake. Are you hungry? Qin Mu looked at him in a daze, and then her eyes slowly became clear. She stared at him for a while and silently closed her eyes again. I don't want to eat. Then take a shower first? Huh? His voice was very soft, and he kissed her little mouth gently. Qin Mu looked a little patient. After a long time, she slowly opened her eyes and looked at him. Zhou Chengguang, do you want to rape me again in the bathroom? His pupils constricted violently, as if he had been stabbed. He loosened his fingers and then held her tightly. He buried his face in her neck and said in a deep voice, Mumu, I'm sorry. If everything can be explained with an apology, then what's the point of the law? Qin Mu said coldly. Zhou Chengguang's breathing was a little painful. Are you going to sue me? No. Qin Mu's tone was indifferent. Because I also enjoyed it. She spat out word by word. Pain and happiness. Zhou Chengguang couldn't do anything to her. He reached out to pick her up, but she waved his hand away and said excitedly for the first time, Don't touch me. He looked at her in shock. There was a hint of disgust in Qin Mu's eyes. I want to take a shower. Zhou Chengguang, let go of me. He refused to let go, and Qin Mu was angry. Zhou Chengguang, even a prisoner has a break. His breathing was painful. She compared their marriage to being in prison. While he was still in a daze, Qin Mu had already pushed him away and walked towards the bathroom. Chapter 2345. When he asked the question, he realized how difficult it was. He was afraid of getting an answer that he didn't want to hear, but he couldn't help asking, Qin Mu, If we didn't sign that agreement and I let you go, would you consider Zhao Yin? Qin Mu's body froze. She didn't look back. She seemed to think for a moment before saying quietly, "No." When a glimmer of hope rose in his heart, she continued, "Because he's too good." This time, Zhou Chengwang's heart felt as if a basin of cold water had been poured over it. It was indescribably cold. He had never been so depressed before. Other than Tang Shui, he had never fallen for a woman. Tang Shui, didn't love him, but Qin Mu loved him before. She loved him deeply, and now, she probably liked him too, but she didn't want to dump him. This made it very difficult for him, and he couldn't do anything about her. Of course, he had also been rough last night, so no matter how hard he tried to coax her, she wouldn't be nice to him. Qin Mu walked in the bathroom, while Zhou Chengwang got out of bed gently, walked to the cabinet where she usually put the medicine, and opened her medicine bottle. There was still more than a dozen pills in the bottle, and they would be finished in a few days. He quietly opened the drawer, took out a bottle of vitamins, and took more than 10 pills. After doing all this, he went back to the bed and lay down. Then, he took out a cigarette, lit it, and smoked in a somewhat upset manner. Qin Mu went in for a long time. When she came out, Zhou Chengwang had smoked 4 or 5 cigarettes. He looked at her. "Do you think I'm dirty and want to wash it?" Qin Mu was only wearing a bathrobe. Her hair was slightly wet, and she was sitting in front of the dressing mirror to dry her hair. The sound of the hairdryer intensified Zhou Chengwang's annoyance. Zhou Chengwang pursed his lips, reached out to put out the cigarette butt, and looked at her quietly. He waited patiently for her to dry her hair, and then said in a hoarse voice, "Mu Mu, am I that unbearable?" Qin Mu put down the hairdryer and began to apply her skincare products. She didn't avoid him. She took off her bathrobe in front of him and applied moisturizer all over her body. Zhou Chengwang leaned there, his eyes narrowed, and his atoms apple-rolled. Of course, in addition to her soft and supple body, he also saw the red marks all over her body, all left by his rough times. His throat seemed to be blocked. Just as his eyes were moving, Qin Mu said calmly, "Sometimes it's hard to bear." Zhou Chengwang's eyes narrowed slightly as he looked at her. After a long time, he said stiffly, "You still have to endure it." Qin Mu didn't make a sound. She just quietly maintained her soft skin. The hot-blooded man couldn't stand his wife like this. He lifted the quilt and walked toward her. He hugged her from behind, burying his face in her neck. He smelled fragrant, the scent of her favorite shower gel. He murmured, "Mu Mu, let's have a good talk, okay?" Qin Mu looked at him in the mirror and said calmly, "Zhou Chengwang, I've given you everything you want. But it's not enough, Mu Mu." His voice was deep as he said, "What I want is not only your physical submission, I also want your love." Qin Mu glared at him in the mirror. "Zhou Chengwang, you're shameless. What did he mean by physical surrender?" It disgusted her. Seeing her like this, the anger in his heart dissipated a little. He let out a low laugh and bit her little neck. "Last night, didn't you surrender? Who was the one who kept crying out in pain and begged me to let you go? Who was the one who told me not to stop, huh?" Chapter 2346. Qin Mu couldn't stand it anymore. She ignored him and reached out to tidy up the bottles and cans. He didn't let go and breathed hot air on the back of her neck. "Mu Mu, love me, okay? I can't control that." Qin Mu paused for a moment. "Okay, I love you." He frowned. "It sounds insincere." Qin Mu looked at him and snorted. "Zhou Chengwang, from the day you cheated on me, don't expect my love anymore." After she finished speaking, not only him, but she was also a little stunned. Then there was a long silence, which made her feel a little sad. Zhou Chengwang was the same. The heartache hidden in his heart came out again. He hugged her tightly from behind and pressed his face against hers, not allowing her to refuse. "Mu Mu, I know it's my fault. I made you angry. If I see them in the future, I'll walk around them. Okay?" Qin Mu pursed her lips and didn't say anything. She was a little embarrassed. She felt that she had been making a scene because she cared about him, but at this time, he had discovered her thoughts. Zhou Chengwang stared at her side profile and coaxed, "Why aren't you saying anything, huh?" Qin Mu suddenly stood up. "I'm hungry." Zhou Chengwang chuckled in a low voice. "I'll go get something to eat." "Huh?" Now that she was covered in red marks, she probably wouldn't go downstairs. Qin Mu didn't say anything. She lay on the sofa and read a book. He gazed deeply at her, thinking this can be considered as reconciling. After Zhou Chengwang left, Qin Mu was a little confused. She habitually went to the cabinet. She had already taken the medicine today, but she seemed to have some kind of obsessive-compulsive disorder. When she saw the medicine, she would feel more at ease. When she unscrewed the cap and took a look, she was a little stunned. There was more medicine. Qin Mu poured out all the pills and counted them one by one. She was a person with obsessive-compulsive disorder, so she knew how many pills there were. It was obviously different from before. She looked at it, then opened the other cabinets, rummaged inside and out, and finally found a medicine bottle. To be precise, it was a bottle of vitamins. She opened it, poured out the vitamins inside, and counted them. More than 10 of the 100 pills were missing. She looked at it again and compared it with the medicine in her bottle. It was exactly the same. The medicine bottle in his hand fell to the ground. All this while, she had been taking vitamins and not birth control pills. While Qin Mu was in a daze, Zhou Chengwang was standing at the door with her lunch and dinner in his hands. Looking at the vitamins scattered all over the floor, he knew that he had been exposed. He said calmly, "I've always wanted a child. When did it start?" Qin Mu's voice was a little hoarse. Zhou Chengwang pursed his lips slightly. "It started in Yunnan. Mu, it's not for my mother, but..." He slowly walked in, put the things aside, and gently hugged her. "I want to be with you forever." As he spoke, his voice was a little suppressed and trembling. He was actually afraid that she would be angry. He was afraid that she would be angry. Qin Mu raised her face and looked at him quietly. "What if I still don't love you again?" "Zhou Chengwang, do you want our child to be born under such circumstances?" "No." He hugged her and said softly, "I will give him a lot of love, and I will give you more love. Mu, trust me once." Chapter 23:47. Qin Mu was trapped in his arms and couldn't say a word. It wasn't that she wasn't tempted, and he seemed to feel her tempted as well. He hugged her tighter and said in a hotter voice, "Let's not use contraception. Let's make love all the time and get pregnant, okay?" Qin Mu bit her lip and said in a trembling voice, "What if I can't get pregnant?" Zhou Chengwang's heart tightened. He knew that he had softened at this moment, so he was extremely excited. He bit her little ear and said in a hoarse voice, "Mrs. Zhou, are you questioning your husband's ability?" He reached out and carried her to the bed, kissing and rubbing her as he walked. "Let's do it now, okay?" Qin Mu screamed, her voice trembling. "Zhou Chengwang, you're crazy." She had never known that he had such a strong desire. It was simply terrible. In the blink of an eye, he had already pressed her down and kissed her. Qin Mu's body softened, and she let him kiss her for a while before she pursed her lips and said, "Zhou Chengwang, I'm hungry." Her voice was a little pitiful. Qin Mu had never acted coquettishly with him like this, which was very rare for him. He stared at her with his dark eyes and said with a faint smile, Mu, say that again." Qin Mu bit her lip and said softly, "I'm hungry. Can we eat first?" However, he deliberately twisted her words and said with a faint smile, "Okay, let's eat first." Qin Mu couldn't stand his shamelessness and turned her face away. Shameless. However, he loved her shy look very much. He reached out and gently touched her little face, his eyes incredibly gentle. She didn't move. She just tilted her little face, soft and fragrant. He was a man, a mature man with strong desires. She was like this, so he naturally desired it. He leaned forward and kissed the corner of her mouth for a long time, but he was obviously restraining himself. After kissing for a long time, he only kissed her lips, not even deeply. Finally, he had kissed enough and let go of her. His voice was low and husky. "Time to eat." Qin Mu lay down softly and did not get up. Zhou Chengwang bit her little face. "You want a hug?" Qin Mu looked at him pitifully and did not say anything. His heart was incredibly soft. He reached out and gently hugged her. "You're getting smaller and smaller." However, he liked it when she was like this. Hugging her in his arms, he gently asked her what she wanted to eat and carefully fed her. In his arms, Qin Mu nibbled on the softness that she had never felt before. Zhou Chengwang felt that her heart was about to melt. It was an indescribable feeling. In short, she felt that the entire world was filled with Qin Mu. He continued to feed her and ate some himself. When he sent the tray downstairs, his eyes were full of smiles. The servants in the house were a little silent because Mr. Zhou and Miss had been locked in the bedroom for a whole day and had not come out yet. Zhou Chengwang stood still and said calmly, "Don't come out tonight." The servants were stunned. Then, they looked at Mr. Zhou with a meaningful gaze. Mr. Zhou was really amazing. After Zhou Chengwang said that, he went upstairs slowly. However, it was not like what the servants thought. He carried Qin Mu downstairs and placed her on the sofa. He wrapped a blanket around her and played the piano for her the whole night. Qin Mu wrapped herself in the blanket and sat beside him. She placed her hands on the piano keys and played along with him. Chapter 23:48. Then he picked her up with one hand and put her in his arms. He rested his chin on her shoulder and said, "You play." He hugged her, and as he hugged her, he became a little unruly. Qin Mu cried out in a low voice, her voice trembling like a little beast. Zhou Chengwang, he was crazy. This was the hall, and someone could come over at any time. Qin Mu struggled, but the more she struggled, the more unbearable the situation became. He bit her shoulder and said in a low voice, "Be good, keep your voice down. Someone will come over." Qin Mu was almost going crazy. She bit her lip and didn't dare to make a sound, but the more she suppressed it, the more difficult it was for her to control herself. She was extremely fragile, and he was strong and gentle. The sound of the piano was out of tune and extremely messy. It was just like their entangled bodies. After a long time, he finally let her go. He kissed the side of her face and called her name. "Mumu, are you okay?" Qin Mu shrank into his arms and cried softly. He knew that he had gone too far. She was such a shy little thing, but he had forced her to do it in the hall. Although the servants in the house were all old, and it was not a big deal for a couple to do it in the living room, Qin Mu still couldn't let it go. She bit her lip and grabbed his shoulder with her little hand. She said in a low voice, "I want to go upstairs." He chuckled, kissed her forehead, and carried her upstairs. When Qin Mu was lying on the bed, she was a little angry and ignored him. Zhou Chengwang chuckled and leaned over to coax her. "Are you angry?" Qin Mu had her back to him. "No." He looked at her little head and kissed her hair. "Are you shy?" Qin Mu's voice was a little angry. "No, Mumu," he said with a smile. "It's nothing for a husband and wife to do it in the living room." As he spoke, his voice became hot again. The servants in the house shouldn't make a fuss. He spoke for a long time before Qin Mu suddenly whispered, "Zhou Chengwang, I'm not used to it. Would you like to do it in the bedroom or the bathroom?" He continued to ask. Qin Mu couldn't stand it, so she turned around and bit his chin. Zhou Chengwang smiled, and it was a very meaningful smile. He thought they should be considered reconciled. From that day on, with Qin Mu's tacit consent, Zhou Chengwang worked hard to sow seeds. He wanted to have a child as soon as possible. Qin Mu also felt it. Although it was a little tiring to deal with him during the day and night, she did not resist. In the following period of time, they got along the best. He did as he said. He didn't go out to eat or socialize and came back early to accompany her. However, more than half a month later, Qin Mu's period came. She stared blankly, her emotions somewhat complicated. She didn't know if she wanted to get pregnant or if she didn't want to. Chapter 23:49. Zhou Chengwang was stunned for a moment. Then he smiled and bit her nose. "I really want to do it, huh?" Qin Mu turned her face away and bit her lips. "Zhou Chengwang, I'm not pregnant. If you're not pregnant, we'll try again next month." He helped her lie down and carefully placed her in his arms. His voice was gentle. "Mumu, don't be pressured. We're still young. We'll have children." Qin Mu nestled in his arms and didn't say a word. After a long time, she said softly, "Zhou Chengwang, do you like boys or girls?" Zhou Chengwang smiled and pinched her face. "I like Mumu. You're not serious?" She kissed him and closed her eyes to sleep. However, The man leaned over and held her hand. I've waited for you for so long. If you sleep now, what should I do? Qin Mu's little face rested on his shoulder, and she bit him lightly. What do you want then? Help me. He spat out these two words softly. Qin Mu raised his eyes and looked at him silently. Then he blushed and lay in his arms. His little hand broke free from his big palm. 10,000 words were omitted. Zhou Chengwang took a deep breath. He had never thought that a girl like Qin Mu would be willing to help him like this. However, this was the first time after their marriage that they felt like they were in love with each other. It was no longer a one-sided effort, but a cooperation between the two of them. Late at night, the love became stronger. The next day, Qin Mu went back to the Qin family. Zhou Chengwang accompanied her back. To her surprise, Yu Muyun brought Cher and Xiao Yishu back as well. What made Qin Mu the most unacceptable was that Xiao Yishu was a girl, and her brother knew it, but now he was wearing a suit again. However, Qin Mu didn't ask for the time being. She just observed Cher's reaction in the Qin family. She seemed to have really forgotten everything. She had forgotten how she had been hurt and how she had been separated from her brother. Qin Mu felt a little sad when she saw how careful she was and how she was even trying to please her brother. Now, the way Cher and her brother got along seemed to have returned to the time when she was afraid of her brother. Was this the way Big Brother wanted them to get along? Qin Mu and Zhou Chengwang sat on the sofa together, facing Cher. Zhou Chengwang was quite calm. In the past, he had indeed treated Tang Shui as a goddess. He had also directly caused a separation between Tang Shui, and Yi Muyun. But now he had let it go. He felt a little guilty to Cher, but a man was different from a woman. He wouldn't lose his happiness because of guilt. This was the difference between him and Qin Mu. Snow flashed them a faint smile, as if it were nothing out of the ordinary. Qin Mu smiled back and looked around. She remembered that 8 years ago, she and Cher were upstairs talking about their feelings, and her young girl's feelings hurt Cher. She was a little absent-minded, even a little absent-minded. Zhou Chengwang reached out to hold her cold little hand and said in a low voice, "Guilt can't help yourself or others at any time." Qin Mu looked at him sideways. Zhou Chengwang smiled and clenched his fingers. You can be friends with her again. Qin Mu's eyes seemed to be lit up with countless little stars. She looked at Zhou Chengwang just like that. At this time, he was her faith, like a drowning person meeting a driftwood. All these years, Cher had been a thorn in her heart, and she was incurable. She looked at Zhou Chengwang, and the corners of her mouth curled up slightly. Chapter 2350. She thought that since he had let it go, it was time for her to let it go as well. Zhou Chengwang was right. Guilt couldn't help anyone. Qin Mu took some time to look for Yi Muyun. He was playing with Xiao Yishu in the yard. Apart from his suit jacket, the little girl was lying on the lawn, looking for something. Qin Mu walked over slowly and stood side by side with her brother. After looking at Xiao Yishu for a while, she couldn't help but say, "Brother, Yishu is a girl." Yi Muyun glanced at her and said expressionlessly, "I know. Then why do you let her continue to dress like this?" Qin Mu couldn't help but ask, "Brother, this will have a huge impact on Yishu's sexual orientation." After she said that, Yi Muyun tilted his head and looked at her slowly. He sighed. "Do you think I don't want to?" Qin Mu looked at him with a puzzled look in her eyes. Yi Muyun sighed. "Yishu doesn't want to, and Cher is protective. I can't do anything about it." He had always been helpless when it came to them, especially when they cried. It was killing him. As he said that, he laughed bitterly and looked at Qin Mu. "Think about it. Ever since Shui was young, what have I not been able to satisfy her?" Although he was quite fierce to her, he really gave in to her in almost everything. Qin Mu was still a little shocked. She didn't care about other things, but when it came to Xiao Yishu's sexual orientation, her brother also gave in to Cher. She looked at Yi Muyun for a long time, looking at his helpless face. Qin Mu was really convinced. It couldn't be her brother, right? Her voice was very low. "Is this how it will be from now on?" Mr. Yu is also very helpless. He looked at his sister. "Let's see how it goes. If she really likes it, there's nothing we can do about it." At that moment, he almost wanted to kill Lan Yu. His precious little sweetheart was a little yellow bun, but now she had turned into a flower. But this didn't stop him from doting on her. Just looking at that chubby little person, his heart melted. So did Qin. She looked at Xiao Yishu with sweat on her forehead and couldn't help but laugh. Brother, I think Lanyu must love her a lot. She looks like Cher when she was young. Yimeyun looked at his sister quietly, but in his heart, he was thinking that if Yishu was like Cher, Lanyu would love her too. Just thinking about the man who loved her and lived with her for the past 5 years. He didn't care. He wasn't that generous. Yimeyun let out a long sigh and looked at her son. She reached out and pulled her over. She wiped her sweat and patted her, telling her to continue playing. Straightening himself up, he looked at her and said in a low voice, You and Zhou Chengwang look pretty good. Have you made up? There was a difference between not divorcing and reconciling. Obviously, Qin Mu and Zhou Chengwang were on the track of a normal marriage. Or more accurately, they were finally in love. Qin Mu grunted. Then, she held onto Yimeyun's arm and said in a low voice, Brother, I don't know if it's right or wrong, but I want to give it a try. She hadn't been brave for a long time. The last time was when she liked Zhou Chengwang when she was young. Qin Mu thought that her feelings for him had exhausted everything she had. If one day she and Zhou Chengwang didn't end up together, she would probably lose the ability to love. Yimeyun patted her shoulder and smiled faintly. He was a man, and men understood men the best. In Zhou Chengwang's eyes, he saw the passion he had for Qin Mu. Chapter 2351. Qin Mu looked up at him and said in a low voice, What about you and Cher? Are you just going to hang there? As siblings, if her brother couldn't help it, Cher would think that her brother was a pervert. Qin Mu couldn't help laughing at the thought of that scene. Yimeyun looked at his sister and said angrily, What are you laughing at? Qin Mu was still laughing. Brother, you must be suffering from holding it in now, right? In the 8 years, when Cher came back, her brother must have vented his anger for a while. But recently, he must have had a hard time holding it in. Yimeyun glared at her. Qin Mu smiled happily. Brother, you used to have a way with Cher. She looked at him. Don't waste your good looks. Actually, she could tell that Cher had feelings for her brother. But with the memory of Lanyu here, she probably wouldn't take that step easily. Qin Mu smiled gently. Her brother was a little annoyed and pulled her over to punish her. He pinched her little face and deliberately made her feel pain. It was very intimate, and this scene happened to be seen by Cher and Zhou Chengwang, who were standing at the door. Cher frowned slightly and bit her lip for a long time without saying anything. Zhou Chengwang looked at her sideways and said in a low voice, This is Yimeyun's sister. Did you see it? His feelings for you are different from his feelings for Qin Mu. Cher's eyes were a little confused, and she turned to look at Zhou Chengwang. Zhou Chengwang put his hands in his pockets and said indifferently, I used to like you. Shua tilted her head to look at him in shock. His voice was very calm. Now, I like Qin Mu. Obviously, he felt Cher let out a sigh of relief, so he smiled and said, Is it bothering you? Cher's gaze shifted to Yimeyun. After a while, she said indifferently, No, didn't you say it was in the past? She didn't know why Zhou Chengwang told her all this. She didn't remember those things in the past. He didn't have to say it, so that they wouldn't feel uncomfortable when they met. Besides, there was also Qin Mu in the middle. Zhou Chengwang followed her gaze and looked at Yimeyun. He then smiled and reminded her, Then, is his liking her troubling you? Cher retracted her gaze and looked at Zhou Chengwang. Her little face was full of wariness. Look, you don't remember anything now, but you are full of wariness against others. But you clearly know that he likes you in the past and now, but you still live with him at ease. Tang Cher, you have forgotten him, but your body remembers him. Zhou Chengwang said naturally. It was quite shameful. At least, Cher's face turned red. Zhou Chengwang had said these words so many times recently that he didn't feel that he had gone overboard. He continued to say in a low voice, I'm sorry. Cher looked at him in a daze. She didn't understand why he said sorry. The way he and Qin Mu looked at her was slightly different. Cher bit her lip and looked up at the warm sun. Her head was dizzy, and there was a thin layer of sweat on her back. At this moment, Yimuyun turned his head, and his gaze landed on her little face. His face was so handsome that it was almost cold and noble. She didn't dare to look at him directly, especially when he was looking at her like that. She didn't dare to look at him clearly. Cher's face turned red. Zhou Chengwang's smile deepened. He just smiled faintly and said nothing. Chapter 2352. Yimuyun walked over and said in a low voice, "Why don't you put on your coat? You'll catch a cold." She felt that her face was burning hot, especially with Zhou Chengwang beside her and what he had said earlier on. She felt uncomfortable and said softly, "I'm not cold." The next second, he held her little hand and said in a low voice, "How dare you say you're not cold? Your hands are cold." Cher's entire attention was on his hand that was holding hers. She lowered her eyes and looked at it nervously. Then, "I'll go back first." She wanted to escape, but he held her little hand and did not let go. Cher's little hand struggled for a moment, but she could not break free from his big palm. Her delicate little hand looked especially small in his palm. The contrast between her fair skin and the color of wheat was very strong, as though it was a piece of love jade. She looked at it for a while and looked up at him in a daze. Yimuyun reached out and rubbed her little face before turning to Qinmu. "You accompany Yishu." Then, his big palm landed on Cher's shoulder and brought her into the hall naturally. Qinmu turned her head and squatted down to chat with Xiao Yishu. She had never felt so childish before. Zhou Chengwang stood at the side and listened quietly. He looked at her with such a happy expression. He thought that she should like children. He walked over and squatted down beside her. Sometimes he would look at Xiao Yishu and sometimes at Qinmu. His entire body was filled with a faint sense of warmth. This was probably the smell of home. In the hall, Cher bit her lip. All right, why don't you accompany Xiao Yishu?" At this moment, there was no one else in the hall except for the two of them. The empty and unfamiliar space made her feel uneasy. She had a feeling that she wanted to escape. This was his home, and she was his sister. It seemed normal for her to go home with him, but it was actually not normal. She bit her lip, her mind filled with Zhou Chengwang's words. Yimuyun smiled. "I have something to tell you." As he spoke, he pulled her to sit side by side on the sofa. She sat on the side, and he sat next to her. It was equivalent to forcing her into a corner, which made Cher feel a sense of oppression. She bit her lips and let out an ah. Tilting her head, her face was filled with helplessness. Yimuyun's hand was placed horizontally on the back of the sofa. His action seemed very casual, but he was still holding her in his arms. These days, the little guy was very guarded against him. He almost didn't even kiss her. After pondering for a while, Yimuyun said calmly, "Qinmu is planning to open an art gallery and wants you to run it with her." "Me?" Cher slightly widened her eyes, but her mind seemed to have gone through the past. Those were incomparably familiar. They were all personally brought to her by Lanyu. There was a hint of pain in her eyes. She looked at him hopelessly, and her lips moved. "Don't think too much." His voice was gentle, and his slender and beautiful fingers gently stroked her long hair. "If you don't want to, you can stay at home with Yishu, okay?" Cher kept looking at him. After looking at him for a long time, she said softly, "It's not that I don't want to. Let me think about it." She was thinking that she couldn't always rely on him. She had to move out, and perhaps this was an opportunity. Although running the art gallery together with Qinmu still had something to do with him, it was better than being a leech at home. Chapter 2353. You don't have to thank me if I'm your brother. There was a hint of playfulness in his tone. Besides, I'm just asking you on behalf of Qinmu. She's a little embarrassed to ask you directly. At this time, Cher thought of Zhou Chengwang. She frowned and wondered if this was a good idea. "As long as you're willing, everything else is fine," Yimuyun said calmly, as if he could read her mind. Cher listened to his voice and fell into a trance again. Then she remembered that he didn't seem to touch her easily recently. Other than rubbing her hair, he wouldn't kiss her casually anymore. Although it was much easier to get along with him, she always felt that it was still dangerous to be with him. But she was glad. At lunchtime, Qinmu asked Cher about the art gallery again, and Cher agreed. After lunch, the two girls took Xiao Yishu upstairs to talk about the art gallery. Of course, Cher was like a blank piece of paper, and everything was handled by Qinmu. Cher was only responsible for providing the paintings, and she used some of her connections with Lanyu in New York to get some paintings to support the appearance of the art gallery, and also to hire some artists. Qinmu's position was quite high. She specialized in custom-made paintings for powerful companies or individuals, and the cost was not low. Cher was fascinated, and they talked until 6 o'clock in the evening. When they finished talking, they found that Xiao Yishu had fallen asleep. Cher and Qinmu looked at each other and smiled. They patted the little girl and asked her to go downstairs for dinner. Yi Liangxiu and Qin Anlin were there, and Qinmu and Yi Muyun each brought their other halves home, so they felt a little at ease. Especially Yi Liangxiu, who had an indescribable feeling in her heart. She looked at Xiao Yishu. That was her granddaughter, but she couldn't recognize her. She didn't know what Muyun was thinking. Was he more helpless than she was? Also, Cher had lost her memory and had lost her previous sharpness. Yi Liangxiu felt even more guilty. She felt so sorry for this child, but it seemed so deliberate to treat her well. She could only sigh. Soon after dinner, the two young couples went home. Yi Liangxiu took a shower absent-mindedly. When she returned to the bedroom, Qin Anlin was flipping through a magazine. She lay down and reached out to take the magazine from his hand. She didn't say anything and just lay quietly beside him, resting her face on his shoulder. Qin Anlin's voice was a little soft. Liangxiu, why are you still so sad today? She lowered her eyes and leaned her face against her husband. Anlin, my heart hurts when I see Cher like that. She lost 8 years with Muyun and lost her memory. If Lanyu were to wake up again, would she still be Lanyu's wife? Qin Anlin patted her shoulder and sighed. She won't. You have to believe in Muyun. He seemed to have thought of something and smiled. Think about the past. Muyun had Cher under his control. Yi Liangxiu leaned her head on his shoulder. Her expression was a little dazed as she was immersed in her memories. After a long time, she said softly, yes, they were so beautiful at that time. As she spoke, she choked with sobs. Anlin, I'm very bad. For Mumu's life, I destroyed such a beautiful relationship. They were really good at that time. Qin Anlin knew that this was a knot in his wife's heart for more than 8 years. It was not that he didn't regret it, but how could he have the heart to blame her? He reached out and patted her shoulder. Now it's already very good. Chapter 2354. The night was like a curtain, and the street lights extended into the distance like a long dragon. Inside the speeding car, Yi Muyun's slender fingers held the steering wheel, and his eyes were focused on the front. He took a moment to look at Cher holding Xiao Yishu in the rearview mirror and said lightly, Is she asleep? His voice was very gentle in the quiet night. Cher hummed in agreement, her voice soft and light. Yi Muyun's lips curved slightly, and his eyes fell on her face for a few seconds before he looked away. It was not until 8:30 that the car drove into the villa where they lived. When Cher was about to get out of the car, he stopped her. Let me carry her. The little fellow is too heavy. Cher replied. When he opened the door and carried Xiao Yishu, she got out of the car and walked quickly. Cover her with a small blanket, or she will catch a cold. He paused and let her cover her. But when she looked up, she happened to meet his deep eyes. When their eyes met, she shivered and pursed her lips. Go in. She walked forward first, and there was an inaudible chuckle behind her, as if he was laughing at her. Cher stopped in her tracks. She stood in the hall and glared at him. Yi Muyun brushed past her, but when he passed by, he whispered, Little fool. Snow's hair stood on end. She wasn't an idiot. His whole family was a fool, but she did not dare to say this. She could only stare at him and purse her lips, looking very pitiful. Then she reluctantly followed him upstairs like a little tail. Yi Muyun carried the little fellow to her bedroom. After putting her down, he looked sideways at Cher, who followed him, and whispered, Help her put on her pajamas. Although Xiao Yishu refused to wear a girl's dress, she was still a girl, so it was better for her mother to do such a private thing. Cher nodded and ran to the changing room to get a set of pajamas. She knelt beside the bed and carefully helped Xiao Yishu change her clothes. Yimuyun quietly looked at her back. Then, he continued to look down. His deep eyes seemed to be on fire. However, she didn't notice it at all. She only got out of bed after changing into her pajamas. However, just as she turned around, she was hugged by him. Her little mouth was blocked by his warmth, firmly like a hot plug. Under the dim yellow light, his kiss was a little hot. He carried her to the door and pushed her against it, kissing her. Cher was stunned. Her eyes widened as she stared at him. Her back was pressed against the cold door, and in front of her was his warm body. He cupped her little face and kissed her deeply, invading her nerves bit by bit. Suddenly, her legs went soft, and she felt like she couldn't stand. What was he doing? She suddenly struggled and shook her head, trying to break free from him. However, her struggle was met with even more pressure from him. "Baby, be good," he murmured. His voice was dreamy as he kissed the corner of her mouth bit by bit, comforting her. He had no choice but to be passionate. She didn't know why, but he just couldn't control himself tonight. Cher was pressed against him like that. The moment she moved, she felt the hair-raising contact. She didn't dare to struggle anymore. She could only raise her little face and accept his kiss. Such a posture was obviously dangerous, because he was on the verge of exploding. Cher was a little scared and felt a little guilty. However, he seduced her. She couldn't help but kiss him again and again, entangled and passionate. His coat fell to the ground, and so did his. The layers of his coat were pushed together, looking very intimate. Chapter 23:55. She was getting hotter and hotter as he kissed her more and more. Furthermore, they were kissing in Xiao Yishu's room without the lights off. Even the sound of their panting was so shameful. She was trembling uncontrollably, half out of fear and the other half out of excitement. Scared, his hot breath was on her neck as he asked softly. She sobered up a little and said with a trembling voice, "No. You don't like me kissing you?" His thin lips were on the back of her ears. Feeling that she was burning hot, he chuckled. Cher's eyes were filled with warmth, as though they were filled with water. She looked at him hopelessly. "I don't like it. Your body is more honest than your mouth." He chuckled and kissed her lips from behind her ear. After kissing her for a long time, he looked up with a deep gaze. "Little liar." Cher shook her head frantically. "I didn't." She was on the verge of tears. Finally, a tear rolled down from the corner of her eye. She then turned her face away and refused to look at him. Yimuyun looked up and asked in a hoarse voice, "Why are you crying?" Had he pushed her too far? Reaching out, he wiped away the tears from the corner of her eyes and coaxed her. "Be good, it's my fault. I shouldn't have treated you like this." He kissed her pink eyelids and said in a gentler voice, "All right, don't cry anymore. I won't kiss you anymore. I'll carry you to rest for a while." Cher bit her lip and looked at him, not saying anything. He smiled and carried her up. Opening the door, he walked out. However, he carried her to his own bedroom. The moment he put her down, she struggled and clamored to get off the bed. "Stay here and don't move. I'm going to the bathroom." He bent his knees and stared at her eyes, trying to scare her. "If you dare to go out, I'll go to your room." She understood instantly. Staring at his eyes, her lips trembled as she spat out, "You're a bad person." He smiled and reached out to pinch her little face. Then, he straightened his body and walked to the bathroom. Cher stared at his back view as she bit her lips and curled up her body. Leaning against the headboard, she stared at the direction of the bathroom. She really didn't dare to leave because just now, she clearly felt that he was very excited. Is he going to the bathroom to solve it himself? Soon, the sound of running water could be heard in the bathroom. She suddenly felt her mouth go dry. She couldn't help but imagine what he was doing right now. She covered her face and scolded herself silently. How could she have a relationship with him? Cher pursed her lips and stared at the bathroom door. He only came out after about 10 minutes. His body was steamy, and he was only wearing a bathrobe. She suddenly felt that it was very dangerous for a man who had just taken a bath. Yimiyun took a dry towel and gently wiped his hair. His voice was indifferent. "What are you afraid of?" He walked over slowly and threw the towel that he used to wipe her wet hair on her little head with the towel on her head, Cher looked a little ridiculous. She reached out and pulled the towel down. Yumian looked at her and took a cigarette from the bedside table. He lit up skillfully. The blue flame illuminated his handsome features, making him look more manly. He took a puff and leaned against the sofa. He smiled. "Don't worry, I've solved it. I won't touch you." Chapter 2356. She looked at him nervously after asking the question. Yumiyun held a cigarette between his long fingers. He smiled at her and then burst out laughing. "No." Cher was a little angry as she glared at him. "You think I'm the bad guy again, huh?" His eyes were gentle. "Cher, in the past, you've always treated me like the world." His voice suddenly sounded a little disappointed. "But now, you're the one who's most afraid of me." Her heart ached. She looked at him cautiously. She saw a hint of pain in his eyes. She suddenly felt uneasy. The more she knew about their past, the more guilty she felt. She enjoyed his care, but she wasn't prepared to give anything in return. And he could see it clearly. She didn't know why he was still so nice to her. "Because it's a habit," he said mildly, reading her thoughts. Cher bit her lip. After a long while, she said uneasily, "I can't promise you anything. Promises are made by a man to a woman." He smiled, stubbed out the cigarette, and walked towards her. Cher clutched the bed sheets nervously. He leaned forward and kissed her little mouth, murmuring, "You'll sleep here tonight. I'll sleep in the study." Her eyes widened. She didn't understand why he would make such an arrangement. Yi Muyun didn't explain. He only smiled and reached out to stroke her hair. "Be good. Listen to me." With that, he walked out of the bedroom. Cher stared blankly at the closed door. After a long while, she went to take a shower and put on a large bathrobe. She felt a little empty being alone in the bedroom, which was full of masculinity. She lay down and switched off the lights. His scent was all around her, and just lying there like that made her face burn. She finally fell asleep, but in her dream, she saw him kissing her. Snow woke up in a state of extreme shame. She covered her face as soon as she woke up, not daring to recall the dream she had just had. It was so real. Every detail and every hair cell was clearly magnified. Even that kind of sharp pain, she could feel it. She couldn't sleep anymore. She covered her face and curled up at the head of the bed. At this moment, she actually yearned for his embrace, yearned for the warmth of his body. There was a sudden flash outside the window. In an instant, the world was as bright as day, and it was glaring. She shrunk back and turned her head to look out the window. Then, there was a loud rumble of thunder. Cher screamed and buried her face in her knees. She was still afraid, so she crawled under the blanket. His little body was trembling. His entire body was trembling. Lightning and thunder sounded one after another. Even in the dark bedroom, it was as bright as day. She couldn't stop screaming and trembling in fear. The bedroom door opened, and she was pulled into a warm embrace. Her small face was pressed against his warm body. When the thunder sounded, she buried herself in his arms and said in a weak voice, "Hug me." Yimuyin lowered his head helplessly. "You're already so big, yet you're still afraid." She was afraid when she was young. He thought that after so many years, she would not be afraid anymore. After all, she was a 26-year-old girl. But at this moment, the little girl in his arms was trembling so violently, her little hands hugging him so tightly, as if he was her only support in this world. Chapter 2357. She was like a little puppy, snuggling up in his arms and kissing him randomly. She kissed him until his entire body was burning up, but he had to suppress it, because when she woke up tomorrow, she would regret it. His hand pressed down on her mischievous little hand, and his voice was hoarse. "Be good, don't move." If she continued kissing him like this, he would not be able to take it. He was a normal man, and the person in his arms was the girl he had loved for so many years. How could he not be flustered? If he did not have any reaction, he would not be a man. But no matter how he tried to stop her, she still hugged him like a little puppy, kissing the corner of his mouth randomly. "Cher!" His voice was hoarse, and he held her slender little arm, his dark eyes deep. I can't guarantee what will happen if we continue kissing. Are you sure? She moved away a little, looking at him with watery eyes. She looked like a weak beast, vulnerable and wanting to look at him. Yes, he could feel that she wanted him. She was so obvious. If he rejected her again, he would not be a man. He reached out and held her in his arms, his thin lips on the side of her neck, and his voice was very low. Even if you want to pull away, I will not let you go. With that said, he turned over, and, as she screamed, he kissed her hard on the little mouth, and they were completely entangled outside the window. The light still shone through the darkness. In the bedroom, in the flickering light, their bodies were entangled again and again in the eternal melody, and the two lost hearts were slowly approaching each other. After countless struggles, she still could not control her primal urges and walked towards him. At this moment, she forgot about Lanyu, forgot about Ishu, and only knew that she wanted this man. She really, really wanted him. And he, who had been repressed for too long, and the little person in his arms was so passionate, let go, and did not let go of her for the whole night at dawn. The rain that had been falling for the whole night finally stopped. The sky was gray, and there was fresh air everywhere, mixed with the smell of the earth. A chubby little hand gently pushed open the door of the master bedroom, and a little cat walked in. The chubby little guy wrinkled its nose and walked inside again. The light in the bedroom was very dim. When the little guy walked to the bed, he saw two people lying on the bed. Yi Sanson was holding his mother in his arms. The little guy's face fell, and he carefully lifted the blanket. The little fellow let out a shriek. The person on the bed would wake up no matter how deep he slept. Yi Muyun and Cher were leaning against the headboard, both wrapped in bed sheets, as if they had been caught in the act. Especially Cher. She did not know how to explain. The little man looked as if he was about to faint. He stared at them with tears the size of beans rolling down his cheeks. Yi Muyun coughed lightly. Well, your mother is afraid of thunder, so I hug her to sleep. The little fellow was still glaring at him, her little mouth flattened. In the past, when there was thunder, Mommy would never look for Daddy. Of course, it was because Lanyu was not your father. At this moment, Yi Muyun made up his mind. But before that, he first looked at Cher in his arms, and then said slowly, Ishu, you are not Lanyu's child. You are my son. He paused, frowned, and corrected her. Daughter. After he said that, Xiao Ishu was stunned. So was Cher. What is he talking about? He gave birth to Xiao Ishu. Chapter 2358. She was infuriated. He had already given birth to someone else's child. Why did he have to sleep with her last night? Yi Muyun could only feel a headache coming on. He rubbed his forehead and looked at her. Do you think that there's someone else besides you, an idiot? No matter how docile a sheep who had lost her memory was, she would still get angry. They had just slept together, and he was already calling her an idiot. That was really infuriating. Cher bit her lip. Yi Muyun, you bastard. He looked at her and sighed in his heart. Calling her an idiot was already praising her. Didn't she catch the main point of his words? He looked at the little one again. She was also staring at him with tears in her eyes. I'm Daddy's child. Of course. Yi Muyun lifted the blanket and walked down. He carried Xiao Ishu and placed her under the blanket. He looked at her and said softly, I'm the daddy. Xiao Ishu was only a few years old after all. She was shocked, and her eyes were filled with tears as she looked at him. Cher was the same. She had lost her memory, but she remembered clearly that Xiao Ishu was Lanyu's son. How did she become her and Yi Muyun's daughter? It was too messy. Later on, Yi Muyun did a DNA test with Xiao Ishu and Cher too. The result was that Xiao Ishu was their child. The only thing was that Yi Muyun still couldn't figure out until now. Ishu was indeed 5 years old. They had been separated for 8 years, so why was she only 5 years old? He vaguely thought that it might have something to do with Cher's illness at that time. But only Lanyu knew the truth. Boy's office. Yi Muyun stood in front of the floor-to-ceiling window. Guze approached him slowly. Mr. Yi, there's news from the hospital that Lanyu might wake up. Do you want him to wake up? Yi Muyun narrowed his eyes and turned his head to look at Guze with a burning gaze. His voice was deep and slow. How could he have a chance to wake up? Guze paused for a moment before he said, "According to the neurology experts, Lan Yu's will to live is very strong. His brainwave data is getting more and more normal every day. I'm afraid he'll wake up soon." As he spoke, his voice deepened. "President Gu, do you wish for him to live or to sleep forever?" After saying that, Guze's gaze fell on Yi Muyun's face. Yi Muyun didn't speak immediately. Instead, he turned around and looked at the panoramic view of B City outside the floor-to-ceiling window. Boyi was almost completely under his control. Cher and Ishu were also by his side. What else could he not be satisfied with? After a long time, he said calmly, "Guze, I've lost a lot in the journey to such a high place. That purchase of glory was more than just a personal grudge. At that time, he was young and full of vigor. He felt that he could do anything. But now, he only wanted an ordinary happiness. This happiness could only be given to him by his wife and daughter. He thought that if he did anything to Lan Yu, Cher probably wouldn't forgive him. He smiled bitterly and turned to look at Guze. If Lan Yu wants to wake up, let him wake up." Guze was a little surprised because this was obviously not Mr. Ye's style. Yi Muyun's expression became even more indifferent. There are too many mysteries about Lan Yu, including Ishu's birth. He needs to solve them. Cher and I can't live together like this forever. He gritted his teeth. I also can't stand her going to the hospital to see a vegetable every day. Guze understood. This last point was the main point. Chapter 23:59. After a while, Yumyun said softly, "Take me to the hospital." He paused for a moment before saying, "I want to see him." Guze nodded. "I'll make the arrangements." Yumyun's eyes flickered slightly. When he looked out of the window again, he said calmly, "Don't let Cher know." Guze was about to say something when his phone rang. He answered the call immediately. After listening for a while, he had a complicated expression on his face. After hanging up, he played with the phone with his fingers and said with a complicated expression, "Lan Yu has woken up." The director called to ask Mr. Yi whether to keep Lan Yu awake or to keep him in a coma. Yumyun looked at Guze and said slowly, "Keep him awake. Don't let Cher know." He was already walking towards the door. "I'll go." Guze nodded. As he walked, he dialed the number he had just called and instructed, "Don't move around." When they reached downstairs, the chauffeur drove the car. Yumyun sat in the back seat with his thumb resting on his chin. He was deep in thought. Guze would answer a call from time to time. About half an hour later, the black limousine arrived at Xinyuan Hospital. The director had been looking forward to it for a long time. The director really couldn't make up his mind about this matter. Who was the person staying in the hospital? It was Mr. Ye's rival in love. It was good enough that he didn't kill him. He still had to take good care of him. The director had to admire Lan Yu for his strong willpower. After lying in bed for so long, he had woken up. Was he going to fight with Mr. Yi for a woman? The director came up and coughed lightly. "Mr. Yi, how do you want to deal with Lan Yu?" Yumyun paused for a moment and looked at him. "Kill him." Cold sweat broke out on the dean's forehead, and he smiled a little uncomfortably. How could he say this kind of thing? Mr. Yi ignored him and walked directly to the elevator of the inpatient department. When he saw Lan Yu, even Yi Muyun was shocked. How long had it been since they last met? That man with a melancholic temperament had actually become so thin. He stood in front of Lan Yu's bed, thinking that his little fool would probably cry her eyes out when she saw Lan Yu like this. The more he thought about it, the more irritated he felt, like smoking. He walked to the sofa and sat down. He lit a cigarette and said to the people behind him, "All of you get out." Guze looked at the dean, but the dean's thoughts were all on whether to let Lan Yu live, so he refused to leave. Guze's voice deepened. "Do you still want to be the dean?" These words were a little harsh. The dean felt a little wronged. He just wanted to work for Mr. Yi. But since Vice President Gu had said so, he didn't dare to stay. After the door closed, Yumyun looked at Lan Yu and said in a low voice, "I should say congratulations." Lan Yu had just woken up. His body was still very weak. His gaze fell on Guze's face. After a while, he said in a hoarse voice, "You are very disappointed?" "No." Yumyun's voice was very calm. "I just happen to have something to ask you." Lan Yu tilted his head. His thin face had a touch of pain. At this moment, his whole body was in pain. Then he closed his eyes slightly. Shanine coughed, and a broken sound came from his throat. And Yimuyun was still waiting quietly, very patiently. Lan Yu finally spoke. "Can you give me some water?" Chapter 2360. After a long time, Lan Yu said in a low voice, "Will you kill me after asking me?" Yimuyun didn't answer immediately. Instead, he got up and poured a glass of water for Lan Yu in a cold and noble manner. He placed it beside his bed and said in a calm voice, "Sit up if you want a drink." Lan Yu's lips were very dry and the skin was peeling. In the days that he was unconscious, he relied on drips to sustain his life. However, these were only enough to sustain him. His human instincts made him yearn for a sip of water. Hence, he struggled with all his might to sit up and support himself. Yimuyun just looked at him coldly and didn't help him. After 5 minutes, Lan Yu finally struggled to sit up and panted violently. He also roughly understood why he was able to wake up. This seemingly gentle man had a willpower that was no weaker than his own. Lan Yu graduated from Stanford University's economics department, but changed to oil painting for an unknown reason. Yimuyun said in a calm voice as he looked at Lan Yu with a burning gaze. Lan Yu's slightly withered fingers were holding the glass, carefully sipping it. When he heard Yimuyun's words, his fingers trembled. Then, he looked up at him in shock. He looked extremely down and out, but Yimuyun didn't dare to underestimate him. He narrowed his eyes and said in a calm voice, "Lan Yu, is that reason Lan Ting?" Lan Yu's hand that was holding the glass began to tremble, and the water in the glass kept spilling out. He looked at Yimuyun, his dry lips trembling. After a long time, he said hoarsely, "How did you know? You didn't leave anything behind, but your secretary, your woman, left behind a diary." Yimuyun said in a calm voice, "Does she not mean anything to you?" He was the one who killed his secretary first. Lan Ting was provoked to do such an irrational thing. In the end, it was Lan Yu's love for Cher that led to today's situation. Otherwise, he wouldn't have found out so quickly. Yimuyun's expression was very calm. Lan Ting is dead." Lan Yu's gaze froze. He looked at the cup of water he had been longing for. There was only half a cup left. He looked at it for a long time before he raised his head and carefully took a sip with trembling hands. It was as if the water in the cup was the most precious thing in the world. Perhaps after today, Lan Yu, would never have the chance to drink it again. Until he finished half a cup of water, he had some strength, and his mind was much clearer, but he could only speak, and it was not enough to contend with the cold and noble man in front of him. Lan Yu raised his eyes and looked at Yimuyun. His voice was calm but tense. "Now, she's yours again, right?" There was a hint of mockery in his tone. Yimuyun smiled faintly and looked at Lan Yu. "What do you think?" Lan Yu remained silent and closed his eyes. Yimuyun said softly, "I've done a DNA test with Ishu. Lan Yu, I'm very curious. Ishu is 5 years old. Why is she my child?" Lan Yu's gaze was a little shocked, and he kept staring at Yimuyun. Yimuyun pursed his thin lips. "Do you know why I didn't kill you at this moment?" Lan Yu's body fell behind him, and he squinted at the man in front of him. He didn't say a word. Yimuyun continued in a low voice, "Because you like her." Chapter 2361. Yimuyun looked at him indifferently. "I guessed it, because between Lan Ting and Cher, you chose to let Cher live." Yimuyun smiled. "Lan Yu, you persevered for so many years and played such a big game of chess. In the end, it was ruined by your own inner demons." Lan Yu's face was ashen. Yimuyun's voice continued to sound indifferent. "You fell in love with her, so you gave up." The cup in Lan Yu's hand fell to the ground and broke into pieces. Yimuyun opened the door of the ward and walked out. He said indifferently, "Lan Yu, take care." Lan Yu was a person who lived in the dark. He was destined to be a tragedy. When his hand was on the doorknob, Lan Yu's trembling voice sounded desolate and humble. "Will you let her see me?" And Ishu. To Lan Yu, she was his child. Yimuyun lowered his eyes. After a long time, he said in a low voice, "Yes, because you are a part of her life." and he had to learn to respect her slowly. She was no longer a little girl who was not even 18 years old. She was a woman with thoughts. At this moment, Yi Muyun felt that letting go wasn't that difficult of a task. If he wanted to get it, he had to let go, because he firmly believed that he was the only one in her heart. Whether a woman loved a man or not, her body was the most honest. And after he said that, Lan Yu's face was ashen. If it was said that Yi Muyun might have been bluffing before, then now he was sure that he had really lost Schwer. She would never be his again. The door closed. In the deserted ward, Lan Yu's smile was pale and bitter. He couldn't help but think, after so many years, so many opportunities, if only he had loved her earlier, would the ending be different? So, love or not, it all depends on the will of the heavens. Yi Muyun walked out. Gu Zhe and the dean were standing outside. He paused for a moment, his gaze quietly falling on the president's face. He slowly said, "Treat Mr. Lan well." The dean was stunned for a moment. Did Mr. Yi change his character? Why did he suddenly become so generous? However, no one dared to disobey Mr. Ye's words. The director agreed. "We will use the best medicine to treat Mr. Lan." Yi Muyun glanced at him and said, "Contact the Lan family and tell them about the situation." The dean was about to burst into tears. He was too touched. Mr. Yi was like an angel now. He was too kind, wasn't he? Yi Muyun didn't have time to watch the director's antics and quickly walked into the elevator. Gu Zhe looked at the director and smiled, then followed him out. In the elevator, Yi Muyun's voice was a little tired. "Gu Zhe, I don't know if this is the right thing to do. Is Mr. Yi not confident? It doesn't seem like it." Gu Zhe smiled faintly. "Or do you think that Lan Yu will do something after the tiger returns to the mountain? I'm not afraid of that." Yi Muyun looked at himself in the mirror and said slowly, "The main thing is, do you think Cher will feel sorry for Lan Yu when she sees him like this?" When he thought of his woman watching another man cry, he felt a burst of anger in his heart. Gu Zhe smiled and just hung up the phone. The dean called again. He held the phone and looked at Yi Muyun. "This dean is getting more and more incompetent. He keeps calling me for such a small matter." Chapter 2362. Before Gu Zhe picked up the call, he laughed. "You're really incompetent if you can't even figure out what he's trying to say." Yi Muyun did not say anything. He just looked at him and picked up the call. Gu Zhe only nodded a few times. It was all the talking on the other side. After hanging up the phone, he sighed. The hospital just contacted Lan Yu's parents. His parents are trying their best to get him transferred to another hospital. He paused for a while and said with a smile, "They're probably afraid that you've murdered their son." Yi Muyun pursed his thin lips. "Let them be," Gu Zhe continued. But Lan Yu refused. He insisted on staying at Shenyuan Hospital. As for the reason, there was no need to say it. Everyone knew it. Yi Muyun looked at Gu Zhe and smiled faintly without saying anything. He closed his eyes for a long time before saying in a low voice, "Let's go back to the villa." Gu Zhe smiled. He knew that Yi Muyun was not in the mood to work, so he asked the chauffeur to turn the car around and send Mr. Yi home first. An hour later, the car stopped at the entrance of the villa. Yi Muyun did not get out of the car immediately. He closed his eyes and thought for a while. The chauffeur was already waiting outside the car. Since Yi Muyun did not move, the chauffeur did not dare to disturb him. He just waited quietly. After a while, Yi Muyun pursed his lips and got out of the car. Gu Zhe got out of the car and called out to him. Yi Muyun turned his body sideways and looked at him. Gu Zhe put one hand on the roof of the car and smiled faintly. Why have you ever been so uncertain?" Yi Muyun paused for a while and smiled faintly. "Probably because I don't believe that I'm so kind." Gu Zhe's smile deepened as he watched Yi Muyun walk into the villa slowly. Yi Muyun walked in slowly. The servants at home looked at him in surprise. "Sir, where are Miss and Little Miss?" Yi Muyun took off his coat and threw it on the sofa. He sat down and asked in a hoarse voice, "Where are Miss and Little Miss?" The servant gently tidied up his coat and hung it up before saying softly, "He's sunbathing in the sunroom on the roof." Yi Muyun thought to herself, This was in line with her image of an idiot. She sat down for a while, then got up and walked upstairs. As she walked, she ordered, "Send a pot of scented tea and some snacks up." The servant instinctively replied, "Little miss has already eaten." Yi Muyun continued walking upstairs without turning back. He raised his hand to unbutton the top 2 buttons of his shirt and said in a low voice, "Then I'll give you another one." The servant was a little puzzled. It should be known that Sir was usually very strict with the little miss. Generally, he would not allow her to eat too many sweets. But what was wrong with him today? It was not Sir's style to indulge her like this. However, the servants did not care about the rebellious Yi Muyun and immediately went to the small kitchen to prepare. Yi Muyun walked up the stairs by himself. On the wall beside the top floor, there was a mirror. He paused there for a moment and looked at his own face. The corners of his mouth curled up slightly. Guze was right. When did he not have confidence, especially in his little idiot? At most, there was one more idiot now. The best way to treat the little idiot was to praise her for being smart. Yi Muyun walked up to the sunroom on the top floor. In a sea of red and green, he saw 2 little guys lying on a small blanket in the middle. One was thin and white, and the other was fat. In this early winter weather, they were actually wearing swimsuits. Chapter 2363. The little girl only had a pair of swimming trunks on her chubby body. It was fine now, but when she grew up, would she go swimming and bask in the sun like this too? Moreover, the 2 little fellows had fallen asleep. Yi Muyun walked over and half knelt beside Schwerer. He stretched out his hand and picked up one of her ears. His voice was low and hoarse. "It's such a cold day. Why are you dressed like this?" Schwerer woke up with a start. The first thing she saw when she opened her eyes was his handsome face. His entire body was leaning towards her, as if he was going to kiss her. She hurriedly used her small hands to stop his handsome face and said in a low voice, "Little Ishu is still here." His voice was hoarse, and he chuckled. "You make it sound like I'm a stepfather." His warm palm was placed on her little belly, and his heart was a little stirred. Ishu was their child, but it wasn't born from her little body. As for how it was born, he thought that it must have been a surrogate pregnancy. However, Lan Yu had spent a lot of energy and money to save Xiao Ishu's life. Although there was some element of conspiracy, he still had to thank that man. Yi Muyun's voice was a little hoarse. "What if the servants come up and see you lying here dressed like this?" She placed her little hand on his shoulder, afraid that he would act rashly. Her little face was also red, and she pursed her lips and said in a low voice, "The male employees in the family won't come up like you, and they won't be as lecherous as you even if they come up." His eyes were full of smiles. At 28 years old, there were already fine lines at the corner of his eyes when he was at his most charming, but also made him look a little more seductive and mature. "It seems that if I don't do something, I won't be able to prove what you think of me." His thin lips were next to her ear, and he said in a low voice, deliberately teasing her. Cher's fair hand landed on his shoulder. Hearing his words, she suddenly tightened her grip, and her nails scratched the expensive material of his clothes, leaving scratches on it. Then she hugged his neck tightly and said shamelessly, "It's daytime now. What's wrong with daytime, baby?" He hugged her, and his burning hot face found her little mouth and kissed her for a long time. She didn't dare to move and could only let him kiss her. She was pitiful, and she was only wearing a thin swimsuit. She was a little scared of the heat of his body when they were stuck together. Ever since they had sex that night, she had avoided him, and they had never have sex of each other again. Now, was he trying to take back the interest? Cher bit her lip and looked at him helplessly. She regretted wearing this. His gaze was as if he was going to tear the swimsuit of her of it. She was so scared that she put her face on his neck and whispered, "Ishu is still here. Don't do anything stupid." Yi Muyun narrowed her eyes and stared at her. She chuckled. "How do you know I'm going to mess around?" Yi Muyun narrowed his eyes and stared at her eyes. He chuckled and said, "How do you know I'm going to do it, huh?" She bit her lip, looked at the bright sunshine above, and then looked at Piggy Hunter, who was asleep at the side. She was angry. "Yi Muyun, you're shameless." Yi Muyun chuckled and kissed her little mouth. He said vaguely, "You just realized? Huh?" Chapter 2364. As they kissed, his tone changed. His breath was getting hotter and hotter, almost burning her. Cher could feel his eagerness as well. She wrapped her arms around his neck and said softly, "Let's go back to the room, all right? I'm worried about Ishu being here." He murmured beside her lips in a low voice. She was furious as she punched him. "Yimuyun, you bastard. Was he going to do something so shameful in front of Xiao Ishu?" She glared at him. However, she was just bluffing. Yimuyun looked at that plump little fellow before continuing to kiss the little person in his arms. His voice was extremely hoarse. "Ishu, I think there's a need to educate her and correct her misconceptions." Cher almost exploded as she glared at him. "You're shameless. I only want you." His thin lips kissed her delicate neck, and he smiled. Then, he began to torture her. Cher was drenched in sweat as she bit her lips and hugged him. He got what he wanted. The servant who was delivering snacks downstairs had just pushed open the door to the top floor when he heard the sound of sobbing. The servant was experienced and understood it after thinking about it. Blushing, he left. So it was really rash. Little Miss was still here, and he couldn't wait anymore. The door closed once more. In the warm sunroom, Cher was covered in sweat as she snuggled in his arms, crying softly. However, the louder she cried, the more he found it interesting. Hence, he tortured her even more. In the end, she had no choice but to hug his neck and call him brother. She praised him and begged for mercy. At this moment, she would say whatever he wanted to hear. She couldn't care less about her shame anymore. She had thought that he would let her off just like that. However, she had clearly underestimated a man's deep-rooted bad habits. Although Yi Mu-yun enjoyed it, he did not let her off. He used all sorts of methods to torture her until she wished she was dead. When everything calmed down, he laid down as well. Taking off his shirt, he wrapped it around her body and basked in the sun together. Cher turned her face away in annoyance and bit him on the shoulder. "You're a bad man." Yi Mu-yun chuckled and looked at her with his clear eyes. He couldn't help but lean over to kiss her little mouth. His voice was unbelievably hoarse. "I'm not bad. Does it make you feel good?" Cher couldn't hear his words. She covered her ears and curled up in his arms. She whispered, "Shameless." He laughed, realizing that she had nothing to say other than shameless and bastard. What child? He smiled happily, but then seemed to remember something, and his smile disappeared. His little girl was still in his arms. She said in a low voice, "Big brother, can I still see you every day?" She was uneasy for fear that he would be angry. Her past with him was a blank, but she liked him again. She didn't want to change because this was the feeling of liking someone. Although she couldn't remember it clearly, she remembered that when she was with Lanyu, she didn't really want to sleep with him. And when she saw Yi Mu-yun, it seemed like she wanted to be with him every day. She wanted to sleep with him, just like just now. Just thinking about it made Cher feel a little ashamed. She bit her lip and looked at him with tears in her eyes. How could he not know that her mind was as transparent as a little girl? Hence, he teased her in a low voice. "Be good. Do you like it?" Chapter 2365. She looked at him and stuttered a little, unable to speak for a long time. The expression on her face was like that of a weak animal. He kept looking at her and sighed. "How should I make you feel better, huh?" Snow suddenly wrapped her arms around his waist, her voice sounding a little silly and adorable. "Big brother, don't worry. I feel terrible." He nodded and looked down at her with a gentle expression. His big palm patted her shoulder, and the corner of his mouth slightly curved up. How could it be? "It's true." She rested her little face on his shoulder and said in a low voice, "Lanyu is still in a vegetative state. I feel blissful but uneasy." He looked at her quietly for a while and suddenly said, "Lanyu has woken up." "What?" Snow sat up in his arms, a look of shock on her face. Yi Mu-yun's eyes were calm. "Yes, he has woken up." She remembered, but she was worried about him, so her eyes became watery and she looked pitiful. He just sat there, his white shirt hanging loosely on him. His black hair fell over his shoulders, and he looked indescribably weak and beautiful. He knew what she was thinking, but he deliberately ignored her. He looked at her and smiled faintly. "What's wrong?" bit her lip and gently shook his arm. Big brother, I want to see him. You just slept with me, and you want to see another man? Huh? He acted like a superior. Cher pursed her lips slightly. She didn't know what to say, and her eyes became even more watery. She didn't want him to see it, so she looked down and lowered her head. Seeing her like this, Yimeyun didn't know whether to be angry or amused, but her heart was soft, indescribably soft. He reached out and stroked her long hair. Do you want to see him? He asked in a low voice. She nodded and looked up at him, shaking his arm like a little girl. Big brother, I beg you. Yimeyun slightly narrowed his eyes. Then he covered her ears with his thin lips and lectured, Baby, beg me to give it a try. Beg? Her eyes were filled with tears as she stared at him. She didn't understand why he said that. Was begging him enough? The adorably silly little girl pursed her lips and knelt beside him, begging him in a low voice. Yimeyun raised his eyebrows and propped himself up. He stared at her little face with a burning gaze and chuckled. Is this how you beg people? Huh? His fingers gently caressed her red lips, hinting at her. Although Cher didn't understand, she looked at him as if she would eat him alive. Eating humans, she could vaguely feel something bursting out of the ground. Then it was like a rewind. 10-year-old Yimeyun, 7-year-old Yimeyun. The way they looked at her was like a milk bun, as if they wanted to eat her up. Be careful, don't get eaten. It was as if there was a string in her mind that was suddenly pulled. Then, everything became clear. Cher's expression was a little dazed. She kept looking at him, her gaze a little dazed. In the blink of an eye, she recalled everything, including the parting and the pain she had suffered. She looked at the enlarged, handsome face in front of her. He was bullying her. She was used to being bullied since she was young. If she didn't guess wrong, he was thinking of some shameless activity right now. Chapter 2366. Cher's gaze was still in a daze. Yimeyun's fingers moved downwards and pinched her little chin, teasing her softly. Little cutie, little sweetheart. Cher turned her face away, feeling a little reluctant. He was such a pervert. Since when did he have such a weird sense of humor? Her gaze was blank, not letting him know that she had regained her memory. She still had that silly and adorable look on her face. The man who was possessed by the J-bug raised an eyebrow and hooked her in his arms. His thin lips pressed against her little ear as he lectured her naughtily, his voice hoarse and hoarse. You shouldn't beg a man to do something like this. Cher looked up at him, her eyes teary. I didn't beg you to do anything. You didn't beg me? His voice became hotter. You want to see another man. Isn't that called begging me to do something? She was about to cry in his arms. Her voice was soft and weak. Then I beg you. His gaze was clear and deep, with the expression of an adult man who was about to do something bad. She could tell. Moreover, she had already recalled everything. Think carefully about how you should beg me. He nibbled on her little ear gently. Cher's eyes were a little misty as she blinked and looked at him. After a while, she bit her lip and said in a low voice, So how about this? She hugged him and kissed his chin gently, slowly moving downwards. His voice was extremely hoarse. Cher, a little further down. Like this? Brother, still like this? She asked in a very silly and adorable manner, but her actions were not silly and adorable at all. It almost drove him crazy. Yimeyun gritted his teeth. It's already very good, be good. She was like a little animal, burying her little face and doing all kinds of shameful things to him, but she still looked very, very scared. It was simply killing him. In the end, she cried and said that she didn't know how to do it, and called him brother. He tried to teach her a few times, but she didn't know how to do it. She only knew how to lie on her stomach, trembling like a helpless little animal. Left with no other choice, he hugged her and slowly pressed her into his embrace. Gently biting her little lips, he whispered hotly, So stupid. What should I do? The little fellow in his arms did not say anything. She only buried herself in his arms and endured his cruel whips. He didn't let her go until night fell. He reached out and brought the sleeping Xiao Ishu back to the master bedroom. Under the warm yellow light, the family of three lay down together. It was very cozy. Yimuyun tilted his head and looked at the little pig lying on the side. He couldn't help but laugh. You can really sleep, just like when you were a kid. That piglet was still panting softly, and his whole body was still in the aftertaste. After a long while, she finally calmed down and looked at him sideways. Her voice was also soft. When can I visit Lanyu? Yimuyun's fingers gently rubbed her little face and smiled. The Blue family is now in the hospital. Are you sure you want to see it? Cher glared at him. She had been fooled. He had clearly done it on purpose. Obviously, she and Lanyu were fake husband and wife, and Lanyu had become like this because of her. And Lan Ting. Yes, Lan Ting was dead. Xiao Yishu was not even a child of the Blue family. With all these added up, how could she have the face to go to the hospital? Cher felt that she had fallen into his trap, so she turned her little face to ignore him. Chapter 2367. She still refused to talk to him and continued to turn away from him. Yimuyun chuckled. She was still so cute, even when she was angry. He hugged her tightly and coaxed her in a husky voice. Then, why don't you beg me again? Cher turned around abruptly and glared at him. He still had the cheek to say that he begged her. She had used her hands and mouth just now, but he had played a trick on her. Jerk! She wasn't good at scolding people, so she could only squeeze out those 2 words. Then, she lifted the blanket angrily and got off the bed, walking towards the door. Yimuyun chuckled softly and quietly got off the bed and entered her bedroom. She slammed the bathroom door shut. I want to take a shower. Get out. He couldn't help but laugh. She had quite a big temper, but he still walked over quietly and opened the bathroom door. Cher was taking a shower, and the bathroom was filled with mist, making her body look hazy and beautiful. She looked at him sideways, looking a little dazed. Then, she threw a bar of soap at him. Go away. Her voice was coquettish and soft. Rather than saying that she was angry, it would be more accurate to say that she was acting coquettishly. Yimuyun chuckled softly and quickly hugged her from behind, kissing her delicate face and neck. Beg a few more times, and I might agree. No, she said angrily and weakly. But how could she resist his seduction? Omitting 10,000 words. When he was completely satisfied, he carried her out of the bathroom. Cher nestled in his arms and said in a low and husky voice, I must see him today. He patted her butt and glanced at her. Just because of that, I want to do it a few more times. So, she had accompanied him to do it, just to see Lanyu? What kind of logic was that? Cher whimpered as he carried her horizontally in his arms. She kicked and bit him fiercely like a wild animal. He violently hit her a few times until she was in pain and became obedient. Shui was crying and throwing a tantrum in his arms. He couldn't bring himself to harden his heart any longer. After lying down with her, he kissed her. I'll arrange for you to meet him tomorrow afternoon. Okay? She looked at him eagerly, her eyes clear and bright, with a hint of suspicion. I'm not trustworthy, huh? He reached out and pinched her little nose. Shui looked at him, at his handsome face. Her expression was even colder than before. Her gaze was distant, as if she had not seen him for a long time. Suddenly, she reached out and hugged him, burying her face in his waist, and softly called out, Gidge. At this moment, she was very afraid that she had almost lost him. She didn't dare to think that if she was killed by Lan Ting, would she never see her brother again? She was thinking of no one but him, because he was her only regret in this world. She closed her eyes for a long time, absorbing the warmth of his body. She said in her heart that she missed him, that she loved him, but she did not want to tell him that she remembered. Perhaps it was to prank. Seeing her act coquettishly, his heart instantly softened, and he reached out to touch her little head under the warm yellow light. It was a scene of tenderness, quiet and beautiful. After a while, she raised her little head, her little face very red. Gidge, he replied with him, his gaze focused on her. His face was really handsome, aw. Cher bit her lip and leaned close to his ear. Should I beg you again? Yimuyun looked at his little girl, almost laughing out loud. He suppressed his voice and said, Baby, are you begging me? Chapter 2368. Cher's face was as red as a tomato, but she still looked at him determinedly. So did he. His gaze was so deep that it seemed as though there were flames dancing in the depths of his eyes. She suddenly felt that her lips were a little dry. She licked her lips, but she didn't know how tempting this action was. Yimuyun reached out and pulled her into his arms. His voice was low and husky. I don't need you to beg. You don't need to beg when you're like this. His handsome face was getting closer and closer. Finally, he slowly kissed her. Once again, the water and dew blended together. Soul and body became one. When it was over, Cher was so tired that she fell asleep. As for him, he was extremely satisfied. Just as he was about to get up, he saw a little person standing at the door. The little person was still only wearing a small swimming trunks. Although it was a little unsightly for a little girl, she was still very cute. At least that was what Yimuyun thought. He stared at the little fellow's naked body and waved at her. Come here. The little piggy stared into his eyes and snorted. Yi Sanson, you're bullying mommy again. Yimuyun sneered. Do you know how you were born? The little piggy climbed into his arms and stuffed its little feet and hands into his arms to keep warm. Even Mr. Yi, who was in his prime, shrank back a little. Then the little fellow said with a smile, Yi Sanson, do you know? Yimuyun pulled the little fellow out of his arms, but the little piggy refused to let go. It was like a magnet, firmly clinging to Yi Sanson's body. I'll count to 3. Tell me where you came from. Yimuyun's voice was a little weak. 1. The little piggy whimpered, but it still clung to him. It was even stronger than a magnet. 2. Yimuyun counted mercilessly. The little fellow's eyes were filled with tears. She hugged him a little tighter. Thin little feet, fat legs, and a little naked body. That scene was indescribable, and that little fellow's eyes were wide open. It was as if she couldn't bear to let him go. Can't bear to part with me? If he really couldn't bear to do it, then he wasn't her father. Yimuyun stared at the little person, his face darkening. 1. After counting, he plucked the little person from his bosom and carried it with one hand towards the door. The little girl was screaming in the cold. Her little hands and feet tried to climb up into his arms, but Yi Sanson hardened his heart and lifted her outside. Little Lawn Air cried out pitifully, Uncle bullied me. Are you still calling me uncle? Yimuyun stared at Cher's tear-stained face. It was as if he could see Cher when she was still a little girl. His heart softened, and he reached out to take the little fellow into his arms, allowing her to put her little hands and feet in his arms for warmth. However, he still carried Lawn Air to her room and went straight into the bathroom. Little friend Lawn Air looked at him warily and covered his little mouth. You're not allowed to peek. She said it sternly. Yimuyun looked at her. You're only wearing a pair of swimming trunks. You're asking me not to peek. He was now seriously doubting how Lan Yu and Tang Shui had managed to bring up Lan Yishu, who was in his 2nd year of high school. Chapter 2369. With a chuckle, Yimuyun filled the tub with water and gave the little fellow a comfortable bath. Then he put on his towel pajamas. It was a blue elephant pajamas and looked very cute. He carried her in his arms and went downstairs to have dinner with the little fellow. Lawn Air looked upstairs and coughed softly. He asked softly, Where's Mommy? Yimuyun smiled slightly. Mommy is a little tired. She needs to rest. Lawn Air looked at him with tears in her eyes. She was supposed to have the backbone not to eat, but she had not eaten since the afternoon. She had already starved to death. She looked at him helplessly and finally picked up a spoon to eat without any backbone. She looked at the bad uncle as she ate. Yimuyun sat beside the little fellow and reached out to rub her hair. He said in a low voice, Now do you know where you came from? Uncle Ye's stomach. The little fellow admitted reluctantly and shamefully with tears in her eyes. Yimuyun's face froze. Then he also reluctantly admitted that Lan Error did not inherit much of his perfect genes. She was almost a replica of Cher, but he did not expect that Lan Error would be so handsome when he grew up. Yimuyun sighed and reached out to touch the little fellow's short hair. He said in a very low voice, Ishu, you're the child of your mother and I. You only need to remember this, understand? Xiao Ishu did not make a sound. It was obvious that she was still unwilling. Yimuyun could not do anything about her for the time being. He smiled and thought about the long days ahead. After accompanying the little fellow for the whole night, it was past 10 o'clock. Cher went downstairs to look for food. She was probably really hungry. Yimuyun sat on the sofa and did not move. He calmly ordered the servants at home to make a new set for her. Cher was eating in the dining room, while Yimuyun sat on the sofa and watched. Beside him was Xiao Yishu, who was lying on his lap with a comic book in her hand. The little fellow was probably so tired that he had fallen asleep. His small body was lying on top of Yimuyun's body. His chubby little hands were also clinging to his waist. He seemed to be sleeping very soundly. Cher's eyes felt a little warm as she watched. Although Yishu was his child, she knew that he spoiled Yishu very much. She ate quietly, stealing glances at him from time to time. There was a tinge of gentleness on his handsome face. He did not speak, and merely lowered his eyes to look at the little fellow. Cher suddenly felt that he was already very much like a father, and he quickly got into this role. She, on the other hand, didn't seem to be able to come in quickly. She was silent, burying her head in her meal. After dinner, Yimuyun called out to her, "Come and help me get the book." She looked up and replied, "Oh." Yimuyun reached out and took the comic book from the little fellow's hand, handing it over to Cher. He then carried Xiao Yishu carefully and headed upstairs. He carried her carefully. There was no way he could hide the gentleness in his eyes. Under the light, he looked deeply charming. She followed behind him. When they reached the middle, he seemed to be waiting for her on purpose. Cher paused, then looked at him and said slowly, "You seem to dote on her a lot." Yimuyun chuckled softly and looked at her. "You're jealous of a child, huh?" Chapter 2370. Yimuyun smiled faintly as he carried the little girl to the bedroom and tucked her in. He straightened up and looked at her quietly for a long time, looking as if he was doting on her as much as he could. Cher looked at him, looking a little pitiful. Finally, he looked sideways and gave her a look of pity. His slender fingers held her fingertips. "Let's go back to the bedroom." She retracted her little hand and stuttered, "I'm only full now." Yimuyun laughed. "What did you think I was going to do, hon?" She lowered her little face. After a moment, he smiled and pulled her into his arms. He carried her out of the room and said in a low voice, "Although I really want to do it, you might not be able to handle it." She blushed furiously and struggled. "You're the one who can't handle it." She wanted to bite off her tongue as soon as she said it. His words left too much room for imagination. Yimuyun's gaze had always been clear and bright. She looked at her just like that and said slowly, "Maybe we can use other methods." Cher glared at him. Shameless. He smiled, opened the door, and took her back to his bedroom. Then, he pressed her against the door and kissed her. He kissed her gently and carefully, without the urgency of a lover. Instead, there was a faint warmth, as if they had been husband and wife for a long time. Cher's body was supported by him against the door, and she felt helpless and addicted to his kisses. Occasionally, he would stop and murmur, "Can't handle it, huh?" His voice was really hoarse, and she couldn't take it anymore. She shook her head desperately and looked at him as if her eyes were filled with water. Yimuyun chuckled and kissed her delicate little chin as he continued to coax her. "Jealous of a child? Can I give what I gave to you to someone else?" With that said, he shamelessly gave her something different. He wasn't really doing it. He was just teasing her and watching her break down. Cher lowered her head and looked at his black head after he squatted down. She suddenly reached out and grabbed his hair. Her voice was extremely fragile. "No." He stopped laughing and got up to kiss her little mouth. His voice was muffled. "Then tell me what you want." She bit his chin angrily and regretted it immediately. However, he did not get angry. Instead, he smiled faintly and picked her up. "Be good and draw a sketch for me." She looked at him in surprise. Yimuyun smiled, walked to the bedside drawer, and took out a few books. When he looked up at her again, his expression was a little indifferent, but it was full of love. He walked towards her and led her to the sofa to sit down. Of course, she was sitting on his lap. She was still not used to such intimacy. It had been too long. She sat on her side, holding the sketchbook that he had given her. She flipped through them one by one, and every single one of them was of him. Those lines, those handsome faces, they were both familiar and strange at the same time. It was him of every age. Every age, he was handsome and cold. Cher's eyes were downcast with some tenderness. He looked at her with a deep gaze. "Brother, you didn't know how to smile since you were young?" Suddenly, she looked up and asked in a soft voice. Yimuyun smiled faintly. "Of course I can. I can only smile when I'm facing you." Cher was stunned. She stared at him, unsure of how to respond. You're tuning into the Romance Rendezvous YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.